On behalf of the Center's Board of Advisors, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this conversation on philanthropy with Jim Piereson. Welcome, Jim. Thanks for coming. And I want to thank Bill Simon, a member of the Center's Board of Advisors, for his willingness to engage Jim in a wide-ranging conversation about philanthropy, from the role of philanthropy in public policy and public discourse to donor intent and the case for sunsetting foundations. Jim is one of the most provocative, thoughtful, and articulate commentators, as well as leaders in philanthropy, and we are delighted that he will share his perspectives and insights with us today. We are now in the 5th year of this series called Conversations on Philanthropy. Many of you have been to our other events, the National Leadership Forums, our Distinguished Speaker Series, and even some of our research roundtables, which we've been doing for the last 15 years. But this series is a bit different and actually one of my favorites. It is an effort to have a more intimate, in-depth conversation on issues that are of keen interest to philanthropy, both donors and foundations in our community. When we designed this series, our idea was that maybe we would have 30 people in the room from across the full spectrum of philanthropy: individual donors, family foundation executives and trustees, corporate giving programs, and the senior leadership of our large foundations for a dialogue with an expert. But you see, when you have star power and compelling topics, you can't keep people away. So thank you all for coming. This is going to be a jam-packed year for the center. I just want to highlight a few things we have on our agenda. So in February, we'll have our next National Leadership Forum, and the theme is Philanthropy and Government, Public Problem Solving at the Intersection. And that will be followed by another national forum in May, which comes out of our work funded by the Kresge Foundation on drawing on the lessons of revitalization in Detroit, lessons for a bold agenda for urban policy and practice, as well as we will be launching a new project funded by Ford, Weingart, and others on philanthropic leadership. So we have a lot to do this year. We hope to see you at various events along the way. I want to take a moment and recognize we have a number of our students from our inaugural class in nonprofit management, or nonprofit leadership and management. And I want to just ask them to stand so you can see why the future of the nonprofit sector is so bright. Plus, they survived my class this summer. But before I let you get back to your lunchtime conversations and have some nourishment, I want to recognize a number of people who make today's event and the center's work so possible. First, I want to thank our first-rate Board of Advisors who provide wise counsel and encouragement to Dean Jack Knott and myself. They are invaluable in sustaining and grounding the center's work in meeting the challenges facing philanthropy in our communities, both near and far. So to our Board of Advisors, would you stand and be recognized? I also want to thank our philanthropic partners. They are listed in the program today. Their steadfast support, enthusiasm, and contributions are instrumental in the center's many accomplishments and successes. So would you stand and be recognized as well? Or you can wave, Margot. And finally, I want to recognize the CPP team whose hard work is critical to the center's many successes: Nick, Greg, Linda, Debbie, Kelsey, Mel, and Celeste. She's the one that works with me so closely. But they really, we're small but very mighty, and so we do a lot. So I want to acknowledge them as well.
I think I know most people in the room. I'm Fred Alley. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Weingart Foundation, and very proud to also say I'm the Chairman of the Board of Advisors for the Center of Philanthropy and Public Policy here at the University of Southern California. So on behalf of all of the Board of Advisors, I want to again welcome you today and joining us for this conversation on philanthropy. But I wanted to begin by recognizing that today is Veterans Day. And maybe we can, if you will, join me and just take a moment, for a few seconds of silence in our own way, remembering the sacrifices of our men and women who have served this country in the armed forces. So thank you for that. So before I introduce our special guests, I want you to know that as with all of our conversations in philanthropy, we're going to save time, about 25 minutes today, at the end of our discussion between Bill and Jim for audience questions. So as you listen to the conversation, think of questions you might want to ask. That's always a very special part of our discussion, and I'm sure Jim and Bill won't mind some good questions. So let me begin by introducing my good friend and colleague, Bill Simon Jr. So Bill is the co-chairman of the William E. Simon Foundation and the Cynthia L. and William E. Simon Jr. Foundation. As many of you know, he sits on the boards of St. John's Health Center Foundation in Los Angeles, on the board of the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and he's also a member of the Board of Overseers of the Hoover Institution of War, Revolution, and Peace, and the Board of Advisors also with the UCLA Health System. So he's a really busy guy. I don't know, Bill, where you find all this time. He also serves as a visiting professor at the UCLA. Now, I'm going to get to USC in a second, so calm down. He serves as a visiting professor at the UCLA School of Law and the UCLA Department of Economics. And not to be forgotten, he also is a professor of practice here at the University of Southern California. So again, even busier. But I also want to add some fun facts about Bill. He's actually a great surfer. He's an okay scuba diver. He and I have had some experiences. Nah, you're better than okay. And in recent times, he's become quite the accomplished mountain climber. He was telling me not too long ago that he back-to-back was it a couple months ago? Did Half Dome and El Capitan in Yosemite back-to-back. So that's pretty impressive. And he's about ready to go off and climb Patagonia. So this is serious, and I'm really proud of him. This is hard work, and he's done great work. But most importantly, Bill is, I'm proud to say, is a good friend and colleague. We've known each other for a long time. So, Bill, thanks for being here. So I also now want to introduce James Piereson. And Jim's bio is in the materials you were provided at your seat. But I also, before Jim and Bill get started, I want to say a couple things about Jim. Infrastructure organizations in philanthropy are often criticized for not providing balance in their programming, focusing their conferences and forums with speakers from, shall we say, the more liberal or progressive side of philanthropy. And I think that's probably a fair criticism. And what I mean by that is oftentimes if you're going to go hear somebody like Bill and Jim speak, you probably would not go to a Council of Foundations or Independent Sector Conference. You would probably go to the Philanthropy Roundtable. And, but that's not what we're doing today. We're talking, we have different voices here today, important voices in our field. And I want to now concentrate specifically on Jim. Jim is a thought leader in our field who I pay attention to, not because I always agree with you, Jim, but because you constantly raise issues of importance that need to be discussed. Jim is a strong believer in philanthropic freedom and donor intent. He is frequently a writer in our field to give you an example of some of the things he has written, in past recent titles of articles include How Big Government Co-opted Charities, Philanthropies as Creatures of Government, or The Truth About the 1%. So Jim is always somebody who speaks about provocative and I think important things. He is currently the president and trustee of the William E. Simon Foundation, and previously he was the executive director and trustee of the John M. Olin Foundation from 1985 through 2005, when the foundation, most importantly for our discussion today, dispersed its remaining assets and closed down. Jim has taught political science at a number of major universities and continues to be actively involved in a number of philanthropic organizations. So with that, I would ask you to please join me for this discussion on philanthropy with Bill and Jim. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to have a chance to be with my pal, Jim Piereson, with whom I've worked for almost 30 years now. And, you know, Jim, I think Dad would like it. If he could see us up on the stage today, something tells me that he is looking down on us right now. So the first area I'd like to ask some questions about, Jim, is philanthropy and government. And the first question is, and obviously there's a lot of focus today on the intersection between philanthropy and government. And you've written extensively on certain possible risks associated, you know, with a partnership between private philanthropy and government, and on, in your view, some of the limitations in any such partnership. Could you tell us a little bit about what you see are some of the principal risks in that area?
Well, sure, Bill. First of all, thanks to everyone for coming out today. Thanks very much, Fred, for that introduction. Thanks to Jim Ferris and Dean Knott for organizing this. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Bill Simon has been a friend for 30 plus years. I worked for his father for more than 20 years. I like to say that the only reason I'm sitting up here in one piece today is I begged off of most of Bill's adventures in mountain climbing and scuba diving and marathoning and things of that nature.
But you are coming to Machu Picchu.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Anyway, thank you. So this is a large subject, and I don't have doctrinaire opinions about this. I do have some thoughts about it. I think in general, in terms of this question of the intersection between philanthropy and government, I think I may be on the losing side of the argument in terms of the trends today. That doesn't mean I'm wrong. It just means that the trends are somewhat working against me. So, narrow question first. I've expressed some skepticism about foundations working too closely with government. As I say, I don't have a doctrinaire position about that, but I think that foundations operate best if they maintain their independence from government. Government is driven by a whole set of factors that complicate the operations of foundations. It's called politics. If foundations begin to entangle themselves too deeply with government, pretty soon government will begin to do a lot of the things that they will often do. Try to direct your program, co-opt your program, tell you who should be on your board, who should be on your staff, and that sort of thing. I don't have anything against working with government. Foundations have actually achieved a lot over the decades in working somewhat in cooperation with government. And this goes back to the early years of foundations. We mentioned Julius Rosenwald, someone has here today in our conversations. He did a lot in creating public schools across the South in the 1920s. The Green Revolution that the Rockefeller Foundation participated in, they had to do this with governments in the Third World. So, and the Simon Foundation itself works with charter schools. A lot of foundations do. Charter schools are public schools. But we maintain our independence. We go in on our own terms. We come out on our own terms. But we want to control our institution and maintain our independence. That's the quick take. The large take is that it's the tendency of government in the United States and elsewhere to absorb a lot of the energies of the private society. In the United States, this has happened because of the enormous financial power of the national government. In 1930, the federal government spent about 2% of GDP. By the 1950s or 1960s, it was spending over 20%, and it probably commanded more than that through its regulatory apparatus. If you look at the whole charitable sector, and I've written about this, all the big charitable organizations, from the Red Cross to Catholic charities around the country, Planned Parenthood has been in the news, major universities, they are all getting grants of one kind or another from the federal government. In order to do that, they have to meet various criteria the government establishes. Auditing, finances, sometimes staff capability. By and large, it's only fairly substantial organizations that can compete for grants from the federal government. So that would be one worry that I have as a person who's interested in limited government. We have a very dynamic private society. I think there's a great threat that as governments enter this field, try to gain control of this field, that we'll lose our dynamism, our independence, and our creativity. The other thing I'd say is this. If you just look at the scale, charitable foundations in 2014 spent about $53 billion on grants. That's about 4,000 foundations. Probably half of this was spent by the top 20 or 30 foundations. Gates, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, others. The federal government is spending $4 trillion. The Department of Education has a budget of about $100 billion. The Gates Foundation is the largest foundation in the country doing medical research. Maybe they spend $1 billion a year on medical research. The National Institutes for Health spends upwards of $30 billion a year on medical research. So you have a situation where the resources available to our federal government in all these fields, and there's no field any longer that the federal government is not active. That was not true up until the 1960s, but today there is no field in which the federal government does not operate. So you have a situation where the foundations often will have extravagant statements of their mission, but they don't really have the resources when you match it up against the federal government to carry those out. Foundations talk about inequality, climate change, all sorts of very large projects, but really the money available to private foundations in the United States is not that enormous. So that's a great change because really up until the 1960s, foundations could operate in a lot of fields without competition from government. And they succeeded in achieving a lot. It's much more difficult today, I would say, for foundations to make breakthroughs in public policy simply because of the large scale of governments, the fact they're in so many fields, and it's driven by a host of things from bureaucracy to politics, to money in politics, to things of that nature. So that's something of a long-winded answer to your question about philanthropy and public policy. Now, we could talk a little bit about some of the areas in which foundations have had an impact, and maybe we can get to that a little bit later.
Definitely, Jim. Let me ask you this one follow-up question on what you said, and then maybe we can move into the historic effects of philanthropy in areas of public policy. So that question would be this. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that an effective role for private philanthropy could be to push government to get better, whether it's getting better in terms of efficiency, streamlining, measurable outcomes, for example, in the world of healthcare, in the world of education? There's been a lot of talk that foundations are going to try, in effect, to nudge the federal government or state governments. Are you optimistic about that?
Well, again, a tough question. One of the problems with improving the efficiency of government and having that discussion is that everybody disagrees what it means to make government more efficient. I might think that it might be beneficial to have charter schools or even to remove the Department of Education at the federal level, but a lot of people would disagree with that. So what the government does is inherently political. By inherently political, I mean it's inherently controversial. And by that I mean people disagree about it, and they fight about it. And eventually they may come to some consensus about it. But so when we talk about improving efficiency in government, you're talking about a deeply politicized environment, so which we disagree about. Now, can foundations nudge the government, or can other organizations nudge the government in appropriate directions? The answer to that would be yes, and I can think of many examples of it. When some of us were growing up, we remember when people would drive down the highway and they'd toss litter out the window, and the highways were filled with litter, and led by a few foundations and some governments, they created a campaign, Stop Littering, put some small fines on, and pretty soon that largely stopped. That was a successful nudge. The various anti-smoking campaigns, I think, have done something similar. Again, when some of us were growing up, it wasn't unusual for everybody to be smoking cigarettes. The Surgeon General came out with a report in 1964. Other things happened. Taxes were put on tobacco. They were taken off television and so on. Smoking rates are way down. That's a very successful nudge. So I think you could think about other areas, but there are some things in which it's very difficult to do that in. One criticism I would have of the foundation world is the tendency to define their missions in extravagant terms, in terms of things that it's hard to define, like, say, social justice or ending inequality. These things are very difficult to address at that level. It's hard to bring them down to a practical level. I think foundations probably succeed better when they can define a narrower mission. I've debated this question of global warming with people. I don't dispute the science, but I would say that those people who think that the U.S. Congress can set the global temperature in 50 or 100 years from now don't know the U.S. Congress. I don't think that's likely to happen. It's more likely this is going to be solved by technology. Somebody will find a way to make the electric cars work. Maybe it's happening already. They'll make wind or solar power cheap, commercially available. That's the way these things are going to be solved. I'm not sure they're going to be solved politically.
Well, Jim, then let's talk a little bit about that second big area, philanthropy and public policy. Can you talk a little bit about historically, with your role at the Olin Foundation, where you really had a remarkable record, how was policy shaped in those days? And then maybe we could move into what are the circumstances that are presented today in terms of those types of opportunities? Right.
Well, I came into the foundation world in the early 1980s, and I had been a junior professor at a couple of universities, as Fred mentioned. I didn't know much about the foundation world. I was very naive about the foundation world, but it was a revelation coming into it. And I joined a foundation that had a conservative mandate. Its mandate was in favor of limited government and free enterprise the Founding Fathers and the Constitution, that matrix of ideas. And there wasn't much going on of a high level in that area when I came into that world. There are a few magazines and a few programs here and there, but there are not many foundations of this character and not much intellectual activity. But I did come into it at a kind of a propitious time. The United States had gone through a period in the 60s and 70s of great instability, as we know. You know, we had a rise in crime, difficulties in the cities, and we had a succession of presidents who had failed. We'd had a president who'd been assassinated. We'd had Lyndon Johnson, who kind of driven from office. Richard Nixon had to resign. Bill's father was in that cabinet. Jimmy Carter failed, was defeated for re-election. So we had a succession of failures. And there was a lot of pessimism in the country at the time. So it was a time of really opportunity for innovation. Now, if we would backtrack just for a second, I think one of the things that's happened today is that politics is polarized and very institutionalized. It's very hard to break through today, and that wasn't the case then. Now, I take some responsibility for some of the things that we did for leading to the situation we're in today. I talk about a polarized political environment. If we step back, the big breakthroughs in philanthropy in the 1960s were led pretty much by the Ford Foundation, which was a pioneer. And they did a lot of great work in the 1950s and into the 1960s, low-income housing. I think the dean mentioned that they started public policy schools in the 60s and 70s. They created a lot of area studies programs and foreign language programs at universities. Russian studies and Soviet studies were funded by the Ford Foundation. That was all great work that they did, and they didn't have many competitors. But in the late 1960s, McGeorge Bundy came in from the Ford Foundation, and he began to create these advocacy groups with Ford money. So there are the Hispanic advocacy groups and feminist advocacy groups, civil rights groups, but many of them were litigation and advocacy groups that were filing lawsuits around some of the new policies that had been passed, the Civil Rights Act, the Environmental Acts, the amendments to the Civil Rights Act, Title VI, Title IX. So you went from a situation in the 1960s where Lyndon Johnson was accused of taxing and spending. You went to a situation of mandate and sue. And the Ford Foundation had a very large role in creating that. So what they did was they redefined liberalism from a kind of a union versus business kind of situation as we had from the 30s into the 60s to a situation where they organized the various ethnic and advocacy groups. And they did this at the same time the Democratic Party was reorganizing itself under the McGovern Commission. So these things went hand in hand because the Democratic Party imposed these quotas in their nominating convention. So this redefined liberalism in a certain direction that's still with us today. And I think that the conservative foundations, of which I was a part, redefined conservatism in the 1980s. So that what we did was we created a kind of an infrastructure of conservative organizations, think tanks, litigation groups. We created, in a way, on our side, what the Ford Foundation had created on their side. And I think we were fairly successful. Your father was a leader in this. Well, we re-energized the free market movement. Ronald Reagan reduced taxes. Look, we won the Cold War in the 1980s. A lot of the problems of that period, inflation, slow growth, stock market not going anywhere, cities in trouble. New York City went bankrupt in the 1970s, high crime. You know, by the time we got into the 1990s, most of those problems were gone. And that was partly due to a lot of the achievements that the conservatives brought to the table at that time. Could this be recreated today? No. If somebody asked me to do this again today, I couldn't do that. It was an achievement of a particular time. We had in the 1980s, we had probably most of the people we funded in academia were Democrats. They were former liberals who had felt that their party or their movement had somewhat passed them by for these other causes. And they were looking for a new home or new sources of funding. And we were very happy to fund those people. That doesn't exist today. We've got a very polarized environment politically. The parties are dug into their positions. There's not a lot of compromise going on. And I think this makes it difficult really for foundations to achieve that very much because of this character. They have to join one side or the other in order to get anything done. And I think foundations generally like to have a kind of a plan that makes sense above politics. And it's very difficult to find the consensus for that kind of thing today.
That's interesting, Jim. Now, just switching gears for a second, now, of course, a lot of attention is being given to the pledge that Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have gone to many people about, and they do it under the idea that it's important to give back. What is your perspective on that?
I don't like the term give back. It suggests they've taken something. And Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Henry Ford or the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, all the great founders of these foundations and all these philanthropists, they may have given more to society by their business and economic contributions and the jobs that they've created and the innovations that they've commercialized than they could ever achieve through their philanthropy. Bill Gates has done an enormous amount by creating Microsoft. Look at all the innovations Steve Jobs created. It would be hard to match that in terms of their philanthropic gifts. So I don't think they've taken anything. I don't think they need to give back. I think if they want to take their fortunes that they've justly earned and return it to society through philanthropy, I think that's great. And they're doing that. But as I say, I don't think the give back idea makes a lot of sense. I think there is a lot of concern in certain circles today that with the economy doing poorly and the inequality that we see around us, that the public will become resentful toward people of wealth, especially in the aftermath of the financial meltdown and the fact that the government had to bail out banks and that kind of thing. And I think that kind of concern is a little bit there with the giving pledge. I don't want to question anyone's motives, but I would suspect that's in play as well. But it's great that they're giving their fortunes away, as long as they give it away intelligently. And what Bill Gates is trying to do, I think, is terrific, his foundation, with the work he's done in education and the medical research they're funding.
So, Jim, final area, sunsetting. You're very familiar with this concept from your experience with Olin, and of course, we're going to sunset at the Simon Foundation. Could you give us a few thoughts on the underlying rationale for sunsetting, perhaps, some of the pros and cons, and what you see as the trends now in terms of more foundations sunsetting, or the reasons, maybe not to sunset?
Well, Bill, we do have some experience with this. As you said, the Simon Foundation has a sunset because your father stipulated that in his will. I think we'll be gone in about 2022 or 2023. Depends a little bit how the stock market does. Now, the Olin Foundation did sunset, spent all our money about 10 years ago. It was the donor's wish. John Olin left that wish with his trustees. No one ever disagreed with it. One of the things that motivated John Olin was that In 1977, Henry Ford resigned from the board of the Ford Foundation. His father had created it. He sat on the board, was very active for a long period of time, but he finally resigned. And when he resigned, he wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal in which he basically said that he could not find in the program of the foundation anything that paid any tribute to the capitalist system which created the wealth for the foundation in the first place. And he felt the foundation had an obligation in terms of so-called giving back to reinvest in the moral capital of the country by supporting the free enterprise system. And he felt that it was highly critical. He tried to work from the inside and had little success, finally resigned and wrote that editorial, which John Olin read. And John Olin knew Henry Ford. John Olin at that point was well into his 80s. And he pretty much decided, that's it. I'm not going to have a perpetual foundation because it's going to drift off away from the program that I have established for it into something new in 20 or 30 years when some new people are involved, new trustees, new staff, and I don't want that to happen. So he stipulated that the corpus of the foundation be spent within 25 years of his death or during the working lifetimes of the trustees that he appointed. And we did carry that out. And took us about 23 years to do it. And we spent probably $350 or $400 million in that 25, 30-year period. And I think we pretty much stayed close to his mission. One of the things was that since we're term limited, there was really never any temptation to depart from the mission that he set forth. There wasn't time to. We were all committed to it anyway. And we were able to take that money that he left and we were able to concentrate the expenditures on the problems of our own particular time. And I've discussed some of them, the Cold War, crime, the free enterprise system being under attack, that kind of thing. We somewhat succeeded, and we made a contribution. I think that other foundations, I'm on the boards of a couple foundations that are sunsetting. The Civil Freedom Trust is one. They often will cite the Olin Foundation. Interestingly enough, Julius Rosenwald was the one who invented this idea, and he was really a progressive in the 20s and 30s. Sears Roebuck, Fortune. He left a stipulation that his foundations should go out of business 25 years after his death. Not many foundations have done that, but I see it's increasing. Feeney and the Atlantic Foundation is term limited. I mentioned the Civil Freedom Trust. There are a couple of other foundations that I know of that are going out. I don't think that this should be required. You know, when Congress passed the Tax Act in 1969, partly in response to some of the things the Ford Foundation had done by intervening in politics, at that point they put in the 5% expenditure rule. Up until then, it didn't exist. There was an element to that bill which said that all foundations in the United States had to be sunsetted within 30 years. That almost became law in 1969. Wright Patman, who was a very conservative congressman from Texas, was very upset with some of the things that foundations were doing. And he had that in there. It was pulled out at the last second. So we almost had that as a law in the United States in 1969 and the Tax Act. I don't think it should be required. Given my general outlook, I don't think people should be forced to do much of anything by the government. But I think it's something that foundations should consider. They may not do it, but they should consider it. I think Bill Gates, by the way, has a long sunset on his foundation. I think it's about 50 years. So for us, it worked out well. And I would say that we had some faith in the dynamism and creativity of our free enterprise system, because I think that some foundations will go out of business, but new fortunes will be created. New industries will be invented. People will become rich off those. They will circulate that money back through philanthropy, and the system will continue to churn out new philanthropists over a period of time. I have a great faith that that will happen if we let the system operate.
You know, in that regard, Jim, are there any right now examples of foundations that you think are on the vanguard of exciting ideas, movements going forward?
Well, you know, I'm a little bit out of that world. You know, I tend to like foundations that kind of stay close to their mission and have a well-defined mission. I like what, certainly like what Fred Ali and his colleagues at Weingart are doing in Southern California. The Bradley Foundation has done a lot in the state of Wisconsin in welfare reform. Johnson & Johnson, the Johnson Foundation, a lot on the anti-smoking side. Look, we know some friends, philanthropists, who've been very active in this whole gay rights movement. We have friends in New York who are very active philanthropists. They tend to be free market people, and they've done a lot in that world. And so there's a lot going on out there. There are 4,000 charitable foundations. It's a very mixed bag. The culture of these foundations is all different. I think the Olin Foundation, I think it did achieve a fair amount, partly because I was a little bit naive. Naive in the sense that, geez, we have this money, we ought to do something valuable with it. But many foundations play it safe. I don't blame them for that. The foundations are very interesting creatures in the sense that they're really not responsible to anything. I stress donor intent because that's a kind of an anchor, but it's just really an account with money in it, surrounded by a few trustees. They can define whatever they want to do. They're not really accountable, but they are sensitive to criticism. I've definitely found that. And when we have made missteps, we found ourselves being attacked, say, on the front page of the New York Times. That happened a few times. Your father loved that, by the way, but I didn't. And the difficulty is that everybody, all you people who are involved in foundations know that, well, you have families, and you have neighbors, and you have in-laws, and when you make missteps, they start to talk. I didn't know you were doing that sort of thing, and it never comes out in the newspaper exactly right. It's always caricatured a little bit, and so I think that after this happened to us a few times, I began to second guess myself. What's this going to look like if this winds up in the newspaper? And so I was always very careful to make sure that whenever we made a grant, that we went through all the steps we needed to go through. Do we know why we're doing this? If somebody criticizes you for this, can you give an account of yourself and why you did this? I think that's very important, both internally and for the public relations side. And I also discovered that your grant program is really only as good as maybe your weakest link. Your poorest and your weakest grant may be the one that gets all the attention, and all the good work that you might have done otherwise gets washed away in that kind of thing. And when that happened to us a couple times, I wanted to raise my hand and say, but look at all, but it didn't matter. So I think that so foundations don't have the kind of limitations that other institutions have. They do have that problem, and they have to somewhat maintain their goodwill in the public. I would say the Ford Foundation did make some missteps in the 1960s. They tried to reorganize the New York City school system, and that ended badly, probably as they should have known it would. But I believe that kind of looking at them over the past 30 or 40 years, they have been very mindful of this problem, that they're a very big organization, and they just have to watch where they step. And by and large, while they do something different than what I would advocate, they've been very careful in that regard. So those are just some reflections on that big problem.
Well, Jim, that's great. I think Fred would like to open it up to questions and answers.
There's something in your background that you've not talked about today, and this is this study of everything, what's the term, Godfatherology? I understand this is
That's very true, Fred. I'm glad you're bringing this up, Fred,
This is
because
very
Jim would
serious.
not bring this up.
Yeah, so Jim, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Bill Simon and I worked on the Giuliani campaign several years ago, and he designated me as professor of Godfather studies because I used to like to draw lessons from the movie The Godfather, and Bill and I joke a fair amount about that. Rudy liked the movie as well, and so as I joke, I'm looking for a foundation to endow a position in Godfather studies.
I have one question, though, that I want to ask, and that is, Jim, in your experience, the importance of, and I ask this because this has been a topic of interest for the center recently, the relationship between the CEO and the board. How important has that been in your work?
It was very important. I think that was maybe an unusual situation. I'm sure it was, but I had to maintain constant communication with Bill's father, and even including phone calls in the middle of the night and that kind of thing. So, but as I say, that was unusual, but I just kind of mentioned the problem that arises when things go wrong. Mm-hmm. And especially foundations that are kind of working in some of these areas that kind of impinge on politics or are controversial to some degree. You have to have your board with you. Mm-hmm. You cannot hang them out to dry and do things of a controversial nature that's going to come back to bite you. So I always felt that it was in my interest as the executive director to make sure that every time we did something, Bill's dad and the other trustees were with us, so that if something blew up or something bad happened, everybody knew, and they weren't blindsided by anything. So I always, there are some people who want to take executive decisions and just do them. But I was always very wary of doing that, especially in the kind of organization we were in. So we had a small board. There were 6 or 7 business people, business associates of John Olin, people that Bill Simon knew. They're basically people who went, businessmen who went to elite institutions. And they were plugged in a lot of circles on the East Coast, the university boards, the country clubs, and the business associations and all that. So I was very mindful that I didn't want to do something that would embarrass these people. So I always tried to bring them along. I think that's very important. Now, a lot of foundations are not of that character, that are doing controversial things, but I do think it's important to sometimes you educate the board, but always to have them on your side. If you don't, I think the executive is looking for trouble.
Okay, there you go. Nadi Weingart, I'm a student at the Nonprofit Leadership Management Program. My question is, with the rise of social enterprise and like the trend moving towards many nonprofits adopting like an earned income model, what do you think will be the effects, or what do you see being the effects on philanthropy?
Well, like everything else, it just depends on how many foundations embrace that kind of approach. A lot of the new wealth, the new foundations are embracing it. I didn't mention it, but there is the Social Innovation Fund that the federal government is sponsoring. It's a little bit different from what you described. It's something I have some misgivings about. They have about $50 million in the federal budget to allocating grants to what they call innovative projects, which have to be tested and measured for their effects. And the federal government, in this sense, has kind of tried to enter the philanthropic world. Of course, this is something that foundations do. I don't understand why foundations themselves can't do this. Why can't they get together and find $50 million a year and do these kinds of experiments? And even foundations are getting grants from the federal government. The Edna McConnell Clark Foundation has a $10 million grant from the Social Innovation Fund. So foundations are now starting to go to government to get grants. So I think this is a kind of a thing where foundations can eventually get politicized and their agendas will be driven by government. So I don't know if I haven't checked to see if the Social Innovation Fund made it through this budget process. The Republicans want to kill it, and I don't know if it got through.
It's alive.
It's still going. So this is the kind of thing I think that foundation should be doing. I don't think the government needs to do it.
Let's take the Ebola crisis as an example. I know the Gates Foundation, that's predominantly focused on vaccine bases, but if there were other technologies that existed, although their focus may not be that particular technology, but what collaboration do you see amongst foundations when they see solutions that may not be within their core focus?
Well, you do see some of this. I think you saw it in the hurricane in New Orleans. A lot of foundations, even national foundations, came together and made contributions. Of course, the government was in there too, in a very large way. We just saw it with the Detroit bankruptcy, where a lot of national foundations put money in there, mixed it with local foundations. So you do see these things happen when emergencies happen. I didn't really notice it in the Ebola crisis. That didn't really explode, really. A lot of people thought it was going to explode to a crisis level, but it didn't really. So I think that happens. And on our side of the fence, we did some collaboration with groups when, like an organization that we thought highly of was going under or had financial difficulty. We came together and gave them some emergency money to get through the situation. So that's one of the things that foundations can do, because foundations should be able to act quickly. That's one of the benefits of being a foundation. A government can't really do that. They have to go through all these procedures. And, they have to worry about oversight from Congress and so on, but foundations can act quickly, and they should. That's one of the things that they can do.
It may be the case that the very first grant gift that I got as a professor came from the Olin Foundation some years ago. We started a symposium on democracy and freedom in the political science department at Michigan State University. And it was to educate and have speakers come in and so on. The reason I mentioned that is you mentioned earlier about some foundations supporting public policy, schools get started, et cetera. And this is a little bit of a self-serving question, but do you think there is any value in foundations helping to fund programs in philanthropy or the kind of thing that you're doing at universities, teaching students about philanthropy and the kind of role that it plays in society? Would that be a worthy kind of thing for foundations to look at?
I do, with a caveat, which is that, and there are some programs around the country, here of course. A friend of mine has one at Indiana, which is a good program. And as long as it's not narrowly technical, this is what a grant proposal looks like. This is how you read a budget. It has to be tax exempt, all that kind of thing, which is important. But I believe that students should understand the place of these private institutions and our broader system, really, of limited government and free enterprise, where do they fit in? And where should they fit in? And that's a whole conversation, really, about our tradition of limited government, the progress that we've made, the role of expert, for want of a better term, expert institutions in a country devoted to democracy. Where do they fit in? This is, as you say, expert knowledge, but experts don't run the country, the people run the country. Where does expert knowledge fit in? So there are a lot of very large questions, I think, that are in play when we talk about philanthropy and public policy and their relationship to government and democracy. And students should study those broad questions, whether it's in the Federalist Papers or in various books people have written about philanthropy. So philanthropy is part of a free society, and they should understand where philanthropy fits in. That would be my view.
Bill, thank you for moderating the discussion. And Jim, I want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed it very
I
much.
want to thank you for your contributions to the field over the years, your willingness to comment on our field, to challenge assumptions, and to share your experience. So it's been yet another great learning experience for all of us here. And I want to thank all of you for your time today. So good afternoon.